Okay, I have a lot to cover in this show, so let's get on. We're talking about the Seminole War Heritage Trail. It's a kind of your tour guide of Seminole War sites, first published in 2015. So now the 10th anniversary, we're revisiting some of those sites. And let me pull that up here real quick. I have a link in the description of where you can download a copy of the book. But last time we covered St. Augustine. Now we're going into Flagler County, see some spectacular plantation ruins, then go to Putnam County, some interesting things there, and then Gainesville and Micanopy, Alachua County. There's a lot of places to cover, and I'm going to start out with some that were not in the original booklet that have actually appeared since then. Let's first, we're in Flagler County, south of St. Augustine, and let me let me share with you. This is my book web page. Flagler County Historical Society, the Old Kings Road. This was the highway originally built by the British. That's why it's called Kings Road. And notice here, the many of the places are common in the Seminole wartime, like Pellicer. There was like I think a Hewitt sawmill, and there was Fort Fulton, a dragoon fort that was here on the old Kings Road. Now, you can also visit the site of Fort Fulton. I think it's on the property of the Florida Agricultural Museum. They do a lot of his living history events. So here's their website, which I will also have in the description. So the first place we're visiting, which is on my uh, itinerary, is Bulow Plantation Ruins Historic Site, one of the most picturesque state parks. In fact, let me stop that and pull up some images of Bulow. Oops. Okay, hold on, I got ahead of myself. Let me go through. Sorry about this. This is the chimney ruins of the sugar factory at the Bulow Ruins, one of the most picturesque state parks. And I was reviewing it earlier, forgot to rewind to my beginning. And the plantation ruins here was the largest sugar operation. Originally started with the British, the Americans took it over. Bulowville. The owner, John Bulow, he was quite an eccentric young man. His father owned the property and died, and so it passed on to the son, who's actually friends with the Seminoles. And he was also famous for his legendary parties. What else do you do out in the wilderness here? What's an interesting story here is during Ranger Academy that I went through Park Ranger Academy back in 2004 when we were doing a field trip here. They said, well, we don't know how they manufactured sugar back then. Well, my coworker Henry, who's from a Central American country, who's a U.S. citizen as well, he said that he knows how because they did it back home when he was a kid, when he lived in back in his original country. Now you can actually go to YouTube and see videos how they do it. It's just adding like a engine or something to run it instead of run by horses going round and round. So another place here. Oh, well, let's not get to Palatka right yet. Another place nearby, which we have on the Seminole War Heritage Trail, is Malacompra Plantation, archaeological site in Palm Coast. This was the plantation of General Joseph Hernandez, who was originally of Minorcan descent, In St. Augustine, he had three plantations. He was actually in St. Augustine, and this is a plantation. It might have been his most southern one. They had here some plantation ruins. Okay, let's go to, before we leave there, there's several sugar mill ruins all through this area. And we're going to visit that once again in our next episode. We'll go to New Smyrna, give you a little preview of what's coming ahead. So let's go to the west, cross the St. Johns River to Palatka. And here's the Bronson Mulholland House and also the Putnam County Putnam Historical Museum. So kind of the neat thing here, let me come back to that. In Putnam County also is where William Bartram went through, a naturalist who was actually friends with the Seminoles in the during the American Revolution, British citizen from Philadelphia, collected plants, world famous at the time. So let me, before I go back from there, share you some other photos. Historical marker in Palatka covers the Seminole War. Unfortunately, this is a very dangerous spot. There's no place to pull over. Maybe if you go around the corner, this is the police station to the right. It covers the Seminole War here. And of course, in my uh, description down below, you can check in the notes. I have the historical marker database. Of course, Palatka is a particular name from the Muskogee language. And then there's another marker, Fort Shannon. What a lot of people don't know is Fort Shannon and the Quartermaster Depot were two different military installations, but they are right next to each other. For example, one incident during the Seminole Wars, the dragoon officer at Fort Shannon was in an argument with the quartermaster who was lower rank, and the dragoon officer wanted his house, which was a much better house, and they sent letters to argue to the Secretary of War. And Secretary of War responded back, said, behave. There are designated quarters for the main quartermaster. Just leave him alone. And the Bronson Mulholland House, 1840s style. Next to it is the Putnam Historical Society. Oh, this is a painting. I think this is in the Putnam Historical Society of Benjamin Putnam. He's with the Mosquito Roarers, the Florida militia that took over Bulow Plantation ruins and put Bulow in chains. The Seminoles later came and burned the plantation and chased him out of the ruins eventually. Putnam Historical Museum. This is significant because this is the remaining building from Fort Shannon. Was the officers' quarters. So this is a surviving 1840s building. And back to the William Bartram here for a minute. If you go to the Welcome Center in Palatka, they cover William Bartram. In fact, there's the Bartram Trail. Bartram Trail Society has a prominent place in Putnam County. If you canoe, you can visit some of the sites on that. Also in Palatka is buried this guy, Winston Stevens, who was kind of heading up the Florida militia in the last battle of the Third Seminole War. And he is buried. Here is a famous picture of him in the Florida archives. Uh, he looks pretty badass on this. Also, remember that he is also the richest plantation owner in Florida at the time. Uh, Last battle, December 1857, and he was killed the next year. He was actually killed the next year or maybe is 5 years later, I'm sorry. Uh, After the Battle of Olustee, he was killed about a week after the Battle of Olustee by a Yankee sniper near Jacksonville. So that's pretty cool. We also found some other officers buried in Palatka who were 7th Infantry officers who were never reburied in St. Augustine. So that's kind of significant. So let's see where we're at here. Go back to Winston Stevens. Okay. So the next, before we get to the Gainesville, uh, sorry for going back and forth. A lot of these sites I'm covering are not in the Seminole War Trail, but I feel a bit obligated to tell you about them. Now, here's one that is in the community of Rochelle. Before you get to Gainesville on the shores of Lake Noonan, it's more or less a crossroads. I don't even know if it's an incorporated town. They talk about the Battle of Colonel Daniel Noonan from the Georgia militia fighting with the Seminoles against King Payne during the War of 1812, or also known as the Patriot War. In fact, I think today, when I'm recording this on September 10th, I think is actually either September 10th or 12th is the actual anniversary of the battle there. They also mention Fort Clark and Ichabod Crane. Ichabod, Colonel Ichabod Crane was with the believe the 3rd Artillery um, in Florida. If you know the legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane, that is who Nathaniel Hawthorne appropriated his name for the novel because Hawthorne was the officer who served under Ichabod Crane in the War of 1812 there. So even though it says Rochelle, covers some information here on the battle between Noonan and King Payne. Going further west, we get to, in fact, let's bypass Gainesville and come back to Gainesville. San Falasco Prairie or San Falasco Hammock. There is a battle here in 1836 between the Florida militia and the Seminoles. Is actually a pretty major battle involving some artillery as well. And that's nearby. There's the ghost town of Noonansville, named after Daniel Noonan, who we just mentioned. Here's a historical marker by the cemetery. Fort Gillian, it mentions, was a fort in that area. It's kind of strange. One of the officers stationed at Fort Gillian says, the soldiers are toiling at work and the Florida militias living a life of leisure in Noonansville. Not sure if it was really that way. Here's another marker nearby about the Old Methodist Church. In my book, Alachua Ambush, I kind of start out in March 1840 when a Methodist circuit rider is killed by Seminoles, ambushed and killed. He was probably going to the Methodist church here when he was killed. Nearby in Gainesville is the Museum of Natural History. So the Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, right now it's closed in 2025. It's for renovation. It's supposed to be open in 2026. This is an exhibit. I took a photo of the Seminole exhibit here with a 1920s man's big shirt, a woman working on patchwork, a beaded bandolier bag, which is probably contemporary to the Seminole War, and a diorama this earlier during the mound builder uh, era, the Mississippi mound builders, before the Europeans arrived. This actually a life-size diorama of a place we visited in a earlier episode at Chattahoochee Landing on the Apalachicola River. I mentioned a mound site that had several historical markers and interpretive signs. This actually a scene that happened there of the cacique or the chief. It's a woman leader, and she is visiting with some visitors from another mound building area, trading items with them. So anyway, let me come back to the slides in a minute. Go to the website for the Museum of Natural History. It says, unfortunately, exhibit building closed. Renovations underway. Anticipate reopening in 2026. So let's head south of Gainesville, and as we're leaving Gainesville, I'm getting tongue-tied in some of this because it's actually the third or fourth try at recording this historical marker for the old stage road. Stage coaches and wagons would often be ambushed in this area around Paynes Prairie. In fact, there's one incident near going south to Micanopy. The ambulance was actually ambushed by Seminoles, and the patient in the ambulance actually rose up and fought back and fired back at the Seminoles and saved the wagon from being destroyed, saved the soldiers escorting the ambulance and the ambulance drivers who were injured by the Seminole fire. This near Fort Clark. Fort Clark was a fort on the north side of Paynes Prairie, this historical marker. And I think this might be a picture I took. I can't remember. Um, it's actually next to an old church, so there is a place to pull over and look at this marker. Uh, and so heading south of here, you enter Paynes Prairie. Here's the park brochure from Paynes Prairie from the website from this, and they have a visitor center, I think, on the south side here. If you go along 441, they do have some exhibits on the Seminoles. They've kind of changed them over the year, not covering as much as they used to. It's kind of interesting because this was originally part of the Arredondo land grant. Goes into history of the Patriot War, and then the Spanish took the area and granted it to them. And this is the actual land grant of the Arredondo grant from the Spanish records. This is in the library at the Supreme Court in Tallahassee. So I was lucky I took a tour of the Supreme Court. It is before the pandemic when they had open house tours and got a picture of the actual grant. So I geeked out about that. Back to the prairie, of course, this is it, where Seminole Chief Cowkeeper raised thousands of cattle. In fact, they still have cattle being raised over this area today. They even have buffalo or bison grazing over the area. William Bartram, when he was visiting the Seminoles over this area, he even remarked on the wild bison that were in this area. You can kind of see in the back it's flooded. It goes from a dry prairie to flooded back and forth over time. But go ahead and visit the visitor center and find out more about that. And of course, going down to Micanopy, here's another historical marker on William Bartram, who visited Tuscaloosa or Lake Tuscaloosa at this time. So we're in the historic town of Micanopy, which is one of the oldest inland settlements, dates to 1821. Originally, they thought it was 1824. Found out it's earlier. So going to the Micanopy Historical Society, in fact, before I go in the museum, going back to our website here, let me go here. This is from the Micanopy website, the Historical Society Museum and Archives, and the Thrasher Warehouse. Skeet Thrasher was one of the uh, benefactors who owned this tobacco barn here in Micanopy. They even reconstructed the Coca-Cola painting on the side. Great museum to visit. It's run by volunteers, so you have to visit on these hours here. It's kind of limited. And inside the museum, let me leave that a minute and go back to our, sorry, I'm going between screens here, going back to the Micanopy Historical Society Museum. Inside, they have a lot of exhibits on the Seminoles and Fort Micanopy. This actual sketch of Fort Micanopy that they found in the records, as you can see, it was well, you can't really tell from here, but it's actually a very large fort. Looks like it's kind of an unusual configuration. It's kind of trapezoid or not actually square, but it had a lot of buildings inside the fort, and I think it had a barn outside. It was a pretty large fort as well as a major military base because this was one of their launching off points into the interior. Here's a model, a reconstruction of Fort Micanopy being built. Actually, first it was called Fort Defiance. The Army abandoned it. The Seminoles burned it. Then they came back several months later and rebuilt it as Fort Micanopy. Here's a painting of it, what Fort Micanopy looked like. You can see it has blockhouses. Now we know from the archaeology work that looked a little different, but did actually have those big oak trees in the middle of Fort, I believe. I think we do have an account of that. Also in Micanopy, this is not on the Heritage Guide, but ask them directions. This is along the kind of the side road that leaves the old town of Micanopy and goes to the edge of Tuscaloosa Pond. This is the Heritage Trail, and this kiosk here has some significant Seminole War signs here, talking about the Seminole War, Cowkeeper's Town, Micanopy, Chief Micanopy, that the town of Micanopy is named after. And of course, talking about the Seminole Wars, is this the one on the battle? Um, my toolbar is blocking, so I can't read the whole slide. Hold on a minute. Yeah, this is about the Second Seminole War. And the next slide, this is about the Battle of Micanopy. There's a painting by Jackson Walker who painted it, and it mentions the battle plan. This was a major battle that actually extended about 2 miles around the pond. The Seminoles attack it, and it's a very unusual battle because I think it happened at night as well. The Seminoles attacked an artillery position. Osceola was leading the Seminole warriors, which is significant, but because there's this is about the only battle that Osceola uh, was head of that's preserved as a site today. You have Fort King reconstructed, and you can call that a battle, but it was basically an ambush when Osceola killed the Indian agent. But that's for another two period. Once you go south of Micanopy, or not south of Micanopy, this actually this off of exit, I think I'm trying to think of exit 382, I believe, or maybe 282. Uh, South of Gainesville, you have the Bar Hammock Trail, and this was the road that went from Micanopy to Wakahuta, covered this area. It goes around Levy Lake. I think this is near the Gainesville entrance, and this more the Micanopy entrance here on the south side along the roadway, where there was more ambushes by the Seminoles on the Army and civilians than any other ones. In fact, I want to mention there's a officer's wife who was killed, and I mentioned it in my book, Alachua Ambush. And her name was Elizabeth Montgomery. Show you my book here in a minute. This is my book, Alachua Ambush, that I wrote about it. My website's in the notes. This is my website where I have my three different books that I have on the Seminole War. So Mrs. Montgomery went on a Sunday ride with about only about 11 soldiers, and they were going to Fort Wakahuta, where another lady, a wife of one of the officers, was. And being a woman, you don't get much social activity with another woman around a military fort. So, she was going off to visit her friend on a Sunday ride, and the Seminoles attacked and killed many of the soldiers and the officers and killed her as well. She had only been married 3 months um, and was 19 years old. She's buried up in Cincinnati. And notice earlier when I mentioned Spring Grove, she is mentioned in Spring Grove Cemetery, which her father, whose name is Griffin Taylor, i- is actually was a trustee for in charge of that cemetery. And of course, the cemetery was open after she was killed. She was later reburied in a crypt up there, which I've actually detail in my book because I visited up there. She is heading towards Wakahuta. There's nothing to see in Wakahuta, but it's kind of interesting. There's a ranch right here, painted sky, and boy, it is. That's a beautiful shot. And their gateway says Fort Wakahuta, which I think's neat. Hadn't been there. Uh, Inside, just this from driving alongside the state highway right next door. So pretty neat. So that covers the area of Gainesville and Micanopy. As you see, there's some major areas to see, and a lot of them are not covered in the Seminole War Heritage Trail because the booklet was written before a lot of these were opened up. So it's a day you can easily spend, from what I showed here, you can easily spend 2 days in Palatka and over in Gainesville at the minimum seeing these sites. So that's enough for now, and quite a quite a lot to see. Next, we finish with the northeast corner of the Seminole War Heritage Trail. We're going to East Central Florida on our next visit and visit more sugar plantations then. And we'll talk later.